Welcome to The Stacks, a podcast about books and the people who read them. I'm your host, Tracy Thomas, and today we welcome to The Stacks award-winning author Lauren Markham. Lauren is here to talk about her new book, A Map of Future Ruins on Borders and Belonging. It follows the author's quest to trace her own Greek heritage, as well as recent immigration through Greece and a fire that destroyed Europe's largest refugee camp. This book about immigration quickly turns into a meditation on ancient history, mythology, and the predictive power of migration stories. Lauren is also the author of a book that I absolutely loved, The Far Away Brothers, Two Young Migrants and the Making of an American Life. Today, Lauren and I get to talk about myth making, how immigration activism is tied to abolition, and the idea of a ghost book. Remember, the Stacks Book Club pick for February is Viral Justice, How We Grow the World We Want by Ruha Benjamin. I will be discussing this book on Wednesday, February 28th with Dr. Uche Blackstock. Quick reminder, everything we talk about on each episode of The Stacks can be found in the link in the show notes. If you like what you hear today, consider joining the Stacks Pack, which is our community for book lovers that you can find at patreon.com/thestacks. By joining the Stacks Pack, you make it possible for me to make this independent podcast every single week. And you get a slew of perks for yourself. Things like our monthly virtual book club, access to our Discord community, bonus episodes, shout outs on the show, and other awesome things. And it's only $5 a month. So please head to patreon.com/thestacks to join. Here's a shout out to our newest members, Rachel, Sunny Mumford, Carly, Shannon Sanders, Maricela Chavez, Bia Z, Meredith Edwards, Alyssa Munson, Jenny, and Alicia Ward. Thank you all so much. And thank you to the entire Stacks Pack. I could not make this show without you. All right, now it is time for my conversation with Lauren Markham. All right, everybody, I'm so excited. I am joined today by an author whose first book I read in 2018, sort of randomly. I don't even know how I found it. And I loved it. And I have been waiting sort of patiently for 6 years, maybe 5.5 years to get this next book. The book is called A Map of Future Ruins on Borders and Belonging. The author is Lauren Markham, and she is here. Lauren, welcome to the Stacks.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here with you, Tracy.
I'm thrilled to have you. I hope at the end we'll have a little bit of time to talk about your first book, but I do want to talk about your new book, A Map of Future Ruins. In about 30 seconds or so, will you just tell folks what this book is about?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a book about migration and belonging, and it centers around the story of a fire that destroyed the largest refugee camp in Europe, which is a camp called Moria on the Greek island of Lesbos, and the 6 young Afghans that were fingered for that crime, in spite of very little evidence against them. But the book is sort of part reporting on contemporary borders and about that case, but it's also part memoir of my own family's migration story from Greece over a century ago, and it's an inquiry into the mythologies of Western civilization and of people on the move and of borders more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about this because the book is working on a lot of different levels, and I want to dig into sort of like your thinking as a writer. But I think my first question for you has to do with the Greece of it all. Your family's Greek. They, on your dad's side, they immigrated from Greece, and you kind of go back and you find them or find like where you're from and all of that. But I'm kind of curious, like at the bigger picture, because you're a journalist who writes about immigration. We should say that, like, that is your professional work. And so This book is sort of like your professional world and your personal world coming together. And the question, I'm getting there. And the question is, what is it about Greece and immigration that maybe us North Americans who don't do this for work maybe like don't understand or aren't thinking about? Like, why is this an interesting place to write what you've written?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so exactly. I write a lot about immigration and borders, and for most of my career until about 2019, I was really focused on, I was writing about global immigration, but a lot of what I was writing about was immigration in the US context. So looking largely at our southern border and, the cascade of borders south of our southern border that kind of lead up to our southern border here in the US. But I started reporting on Greece because I had a feeling, a hunch, a sort of like spidey sense that there was something that I was mostly dismissing at the time, but I was sort of like, well, let me just follow my notes here. That there was like some interesting symmetry between what was happening in the US and what was happening in Europe in terms of the very large number of people coming and the very massive efforts of the governments, in our case, the U.S. government, and in Europe, like many governments working, together as the EU to keep people from crossing the border, mostly refugees and asylum seekers, out, increasingly at any cost. So I saw this symmetry between, or possible symmetry between what was happening here and what was happening there, and I wanted to know more about that. But I also had this interesting sense of this is this place that's a mythological place in my mind, because it's where my family's origin story is narrated from, right? Like my family understands itself to be from this place that I'd never been. And we have this migration story from this place. And meanwhile, there are so many, millions of people who are trying to get to Europe, who are crossing very, very perilous crossings, like they do in the United States, to get to Europe. And Greece is because Greece is on the edge of Europe, Greece is kind of a gateway into the European Union. So that was sort of where that is why Greece, and sort of where I started. It was also of note to me that Greece was this place that is so foundational, its mythological standing, and it's the role of its mythologies. The mythologies that come from ancient Greece are really critical and key within the West's the so-called West's idea of itself. So I was kind of interested in all of those things, like this place where my family comes from. It's this place where all of these people are going. There are these symmetries to what's happening in the United States. And it's also this place that narrates itself as the origin of Western civilization, which in and of itself is a myth, right?
Right. And your book is very interested in myths and myth making about Greece and about immigration and about America or established places to where immigrants want to go, and established is in giant air quotes there.
Yes.
But I guess the question around myth making for me, and the thing, as I was reading the book, early in the book, you sort of talk about ancient Greece and the Parthenon, which I have been to, like a good little tourist.
Yes.
Shout out to all the tourists out there.
Yes.
And you talk about how it wasn't always white. Like all of the ancient Greek stuff had paint and stuff on it. It was colors. And that really messed with my brain, because so much of America's visual mythology, if not also the idea of democracy and all of that, is tied to these great white pillars and this certain kind of architecture that harkens back to a certain place and a certain time. And from the beginning, you're sort of excavating, I guess, pun intended, what our country is founded on, and what it means to be American, and what it means to support democracy and all of these things. And I guess was that something that was the myth stuff something that you knew and understood as you were going in, or was that something that sort of revealed itself to you once you got in there and started thinking about this project?
I would say both. Both are true. I was really interested, most of the people coming to Greece, although not all, but many are coming via sea crossings. And that's true. Many people are coming into Europe via the sea. And, one of the most famous texts that many of us were forced to read, probably a little bit too early, in my opinion, but in our lives, was the Odyssey, right? There's this valiant hero traveling these seas, and there's this sort of he's an historical figure, but it's also this mythology built around this historical figure, right, of his homecoming. And it's that's what he's trying to do. He's fleeing violence and experiencing all of these hardships, and he's trying to get to safety and home. And so I was sort of interested in this idea of this is the landscape of the Odyssey. This is the landscape of journeys and journey making and the mythological heroic journey. And when did the journey turn from the territory of the hero into the territory of the wretch or the rejected or, the misbegotten or the disenfranchised, right? And so I was sort of interested in that symmetry, although, I knew that wasn't exactly enough to make a book out of. But again, in the sort of early stages, I was interested in that. But what revealed itself, the layers of mythology and myth making kept revealing themselves to me over time, the more I researched this book. And everything from what you're talking about, like the mythology of whiteness, the myth of whiteness in ancient sculptures, right? This idea that like we see this classical and now neoclassical or contemporary classical images, and the way that's understood is this bare white lustrous stone. Well, that's, that paint just flecked off, right? Like it was in fact incredibly colorful. But there's also the myth of whiteness in general, like in terms of human whiteness, right? Like a lot of white supremacists today use the ancient world as a touchstone for their idea and ideals of white supremacy. But in fact, whiteness didn't exist as a concept. The great scholar Nell Irvin Painter writes beautifully about this, and I quote her in the book, there was no idea of whiteness. There was no concept of whiteness in the ancient world. So that's something that's been created, right, in arrears. And that's what a myth is, right? It's a story we make backward. It's a story we tell backward to make sense of the present, right? And some myths are much more pernicious than others. So yeah, I would say that like I understood there were some like interesting mythological things that were elements of this book that were calling me from the beginning, but more and more uncovered themselves and revealed themselves over time.
Right. I want to talk about what you sort of just touched on, also the idea that like coming to a new place by sea or like going somewhere in certain myths is, is a hero's journey and to be lauded and this great thing. And now we're in a time and place where people who leave their home to go to a new land, to find a better world, are criminalized, villainized, dehumanized, all the bad-ized is. But I want to know, I guess, just like from your research and knowledge, was there ever a time since the great myths of the world where immigrants and refugees were welcomed contemporaneously? Like we know from American history and like from your family history in this book, like nobody liked the Greeks when they came. Nobody liked the Irish. Nobody liked,
you name it.
Yeah, anything. Anybody who's coming, we don't like it. The Polish, the Mexicans, the El Salvadorians, like we hate you. Has there ever been a time where immigrants were welcomed warmly from jump for longer than like a few weeks by the locals? Because in your book, you do talk about how some Greek people were very welcoming to the refugees, but that has quickly changed. So like, is there any time that it's been nice?
Yeah. So I would say, to your sort of last point there, one of the great tragedies of what's happened to refugees in contemporary Greece is that they were welcomed largely, by and large, with open arms. And, various people in Greece were nominated for the Nobel Prize in 2015 for what they were doing to welcome refugees to their shores. And since then, the situation has curdled for all sorts of reasons that we can talk about later. And there is a huge anti-immigrant, there's a huge, beautiful humanitarian solidarity movement, but there's a massive anti-immigrant upswell there. But to your question about, throughout human history, I mean, I think there are times and places and sort of cultures past and present and in far past and present and in the middle where refugees have been more welcomed. But ancient Greece is actually a place that we can look. The writer John Washington, who has a new book coming out soon about a case for open borders, he's a fantastic immigration journalist, and he writes beautifully about how, asylum in ancient Greece was not just a political practice, but almost a spiritual idea. The idea that we must, asulia means protected by the gods. That's where asylum comes from. So one could come, there was a ritual where one would come into the city state and go to a particular place and wrap a branch around their arm. And that was, their application for asylum. It was sort of like an application and a supplication and saying, I need protection. I need to be here. And that was a pretty time-honored practice. So it's interesting that, this place that so many, again, scare quotes here, but Western countries look to as the birthplace of civilization itself, and certainly of Western civilization. And these now Western countries are doing so much to try to keep refugees out, are actually forgetting this fundamental idea and ideal of ancient Greece and of democracy, which is that we want to protect our neighbors when they need protection, and we want to offer this practice.
Okay, well, you teased this earlier. You said for many reasons things have changed in Greece and the people who are welcoming folks with open arms. You said we'll get to that later. Well, let's just get to it now. What happened? Like what the fuck?
Yeah. I mean, I think a couple of things. One is that people were out there welcome, right? And situations were out there welcome. So, truly grandmothers in Greece were walking down to the shore, baking cookies and handing, and baking bread and giving what little they had to the refugees who were landing. Tons of Greeks and people from all over Europe came to, especially islands like Lesbos and Chios and Samos, the hotspot islands on which are kind of closest to Turkey. So where many of the boats land because of their geographic proximity to the border. And, fishermen were halting their fishing operations and going out and truly like lifting people from the sea and saving them. And over time, resources become drained. That is, a fisherman has to go back and fish. And there is a sense that, okay, where is the help from outside? It's one thing, an emergency. When something is happening for a couple of months, for a year, we can call it an emergency. I think when the same circumstance continues over years and years and years, which it has basically since 2015, with some ebbing and flowing, that ceases to feel to the people living there like an emergency, and it feels like an abandonment to a lot of people. They feel like, okay, where is Germany here? Where are other more resource countries in the EU coming to help us? Why is it that we are shouldering the work of caring for these people and managing this emergency, right? So I think there's that. But also, like in the United States and like in countries all over, the world, immigrants and refugees have been used as a political football and a rallying cry for right-wing populism, right? To say, vote for us because look at what's happening here. Look at all of these people. They're not desperate refugees coming here. They're people coming to steal your jobs and your livelihoods and to take your homes. And these are invaders, right? So the profile of the refugee all over the world has been cast as an invader. And Greece, right-wing leaders in Greece have capitalized upon that and won. And then I would also say that it's important to remember and hold the context of the 2008 debt crisis and what that did to Greece. I mean, Greece is still reeling from the effects of the 2008 debt crisis, that effectively the powers of Europe hitched Greece to an endless debt regime. Right. So it's one of the poorest countries in Europe. So you have people sort of saying like, well, wait a second. We have Angela Merkel, we have the Germans, and like all these countries in Europe that sort of created this crisis for us and make us one of the poorest countries in Europe. They are telling us what we have to do with the refugees for Europe. And sure, they're sending money here, but they decide how many refugees they take and when they take them and who gets asylum and who doesn't. We're, an island, the island of Lesbos is 90,000 people who live there. And there have been 20,000, 30,000 refugees on the island at any one given time at certain points. Like that does not feel to people living on Lesbos like an equitable shouldering of the care for refugees. So I think like some people are just furious at at the rest of Europe for not helping more. And I would also say that there are other there are other people who are angry at the refugees themselves for them coming at all.
Right. One of the things that I have become obsessed with in the years that I've been doing this podcast is abolition. It started as an interest in police and prison abolition. Since I have been reading in those spaces, I've realized it's actually like a lot of other things, including especially immigration and borders and these detention centers and all of this stuff. And you don't spend a ton of time on it in the book because it's really not the point of your book. But towards the end, you do sort of talk about like what can be done or what could be done differently. You mentioned that like detentions are $134 a day per person, but other models, which are like a case management model, cost only $4 a day per person. And I guess the bigger question for me as I think about, because one of the things that I love about abolition and the thinking is like, what is possible? Like, how am I limiting myself to thinking within these systems that are already broken, and what can we do that's bigger or better? And so my question for you, and I don't know if there's an answer, but like, do we need borders?
I don't think I certainly think we do not need borders in the way that we have them, right? And I think that we do not need militarized borders that are such wicked, terrible lines in the sand, right? That are fortified and treated as absolutes, right? When they're actually figments of the political and social imagination.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, I'll plug, I have not read it, but I really admire his writing. I'll plug John Washington's forthcoming book, which is, A Case Against Borders, because that's like the project of that book.
Right.
But what I will say is that the border has become a political tool and a symbol, but a very like real symbol, to send the very message I was just talking about with that, like the politicians are sending to the Greeks. And again, this, has echoes everywhere, including very, very, very to any US American listener, right? Like we have heard this story. We hear this all the time. We're hearing it right now with Abbott in Texas, right? Like, and, with Florida and all sorts of political rhetoric of, we must seal our borders. If we don't, they are coming for us. If we don't, this horrific thing will happen. And it creates a boogeyman out of anyone on the other side of the border. It creates an othering, and that is an incredibly effective political tool. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I've been writing and thinking about, and I write about it a little bit in the book, and I've been writing about it since, is the way that not only are immigrants othered and turned into sort of rendered as criminals, as invaders, marauding invaders, right? These characters of malicious intent coming for you. Like it really is sort of like, they're like, the zombie apocalypse is not like a totally unfair like corollary here, right? Like there are these like scary, terrifying people on the other side coming for us. And that is why we must do everything to protect the border. So we criminalize immigrants. And that's exactly what happened to the 6 Afghans I write about in this case, that it's like, okay, this place burned down, someone needs to pay for it. These 6 will do. So we criminalize immigrants and we decide that they can be, to your point about abolition, we decide that they must be housed in prisons, right? That's what detention is. It's a prison. So the immigrants come across, we're going to put them in prison, even if they are fighting for a case to stay and they have a case, moving through courts, they can still be staying in prison. But we also are increasingly criminalizing the people helping them, right? And so the border is not only an effective tool and the sort of fortification of the border and the mythology of the border is not only an effective tool in stripping rights and humanity of people immigrating, but it's also a wildly effective tool to get citizens and people living on this side of the border, right, inside the border, to give up and cede their rights. And that is the major autocratic project, right? That we will all cede rights because the border and protecting it is so important. And we see that happening all the time.
Right.
And we see it happening increasingly. And that is like, that's what Stephen Miller has sort of laid out in Trump's immigration plan.
Right. And it should be said, you said it in the book very clearly, but for folks at home, like it's not illegal to come to a country and seek asylum. Like that is fully legal. So the idea that people are being imprisoned for that behavior, and by behavior, I mean doing a thing to save their lives and their families. I shouldn't say behavior because behavior sounds like naughty. I've been around too many 4-year-olds, I guess. But that people are being criminalized for doing something that has been, globally agreed on is within their human rights. That's the part that's like extra super duper fucked up. Because at least like when you are criminalizing people for committing crimes, there's some argument that if you believe in punishment, then they are deserving of punishment because they've committed a crime. But in this case, you're punishing people for doing something that is allegedly within their human rights, which makes it like extra super duper fucked.
It's within their rights under international law and U.S. domestic law, right? It's
part of our myth, right? Part of the American myth is this great melting pot. We have all these cultures. America's great because we're a country of immigrants. Like all of our national mythology, or a huge part of it, is around this idea of send us your weary or whatever the fuck, Lady Liberty. I don't know. I'm not into the myths, but like it's you can't. It's like almost impossible to square all of that with what's actually happening unless you're like, well, America's full of shit, which some of us are okay saying that, but if you're not, like it's hard.
Well, I think you're hitting on exactly what sort of the initial compulsion to write this book and it continued preoccupation as I was writing it, which is this idea that my family sort of holds, and a lot of white US American families of like the Ellis Island era hold onto and get to sort of hold this valiant story of, you know, someone came here and sacrificed, and because of the opportunities they were afforded and their bootstrappy hard work, we get to be who we are, right? And we get to have our life thanks to them and thanks to this, you know, so-called American dream. And that is frankly like a wildly sanitized story, like again, a mythology, something we've created, you know, in retrospect. That's a story we've told backwards, right? To make sense of the present and to make the present meaningful, we've told a story backward, because the fact is, there are lots of scholars who write really beautifully about this. We sort of sanitized the Ellis Island experience, you know. It was actually like really awful and really horrible. And, you know, as I sort of write and ruminate about in the book, my great-grandmother had 4 kids. And 2 of them, you know, one was my grandmother and one was my Uncle Nicky. And the other 2 died really tragic early deaths. So this story, even just like within my own family, this story of like, everything's great, worked out great for us because of the American dream. Like, it's not true. It's actually like 50% of, you know, my immigrant grandmother's children, great-grandmother's children, you know, had very tragic lives. And, you know, one of the other preoccupations that the book was holding was like, so my family gets to have sort of that story and gets to tell the story backward. And yet contemporary immigrants are relegated to the space of the criminal and the invader and the, you know, the person crossing that line. So we have this wild double standard among white US Americans who kind of hold dear to the story of where they came from, while also either tacitly or actively supporting the exclusion of contemporary immigrants.
Yeah. Okay, wait, let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. Valentine's Day is upon us, and I've got love on the brain. Love for books, duh, of course. Hello. Did you forget what podcast you're listening to? I love bringing you all great reads, exclusive author interviews, and behind the scenes book gossip. But I can only do that with your support over on Patreon and Substack. Our Stacks Patreon community, also known as the Stacks Pack, is where you can go for book club meetups, a private, very active Discord, and a year-long mega reading challenge to help you achieve all your reading goals. Plus, you also get that monthly bonus episode. Now, over on the Substack, you can subscribe to my newsletter, Unstacked, where I keep the book conversations going. I also give you a healthy dose of sports and pop culture, definitely some hot takes happening over there. And again, that bonus episode. If you don't have a few dollars to spare, don't worry. There are free options on the Substack and the Patreon to get you a little extra Stacks magic. Making this podcast is a total team effort, and by supporting my Patreon and my Substack, you allow me to support my amazing team that makes the show possible every single week. So if you or your friends are looking to meet other book lovers and support this indie podcast, come hang out with me on Patreon, Substack, or both. I would love to have you. And since we're talking about love, you can gift subscriptions to the Patreon and the Substack for that special reader in your life. For the Stacks Pack, head to patreon.com/thestacks. And for the newsletter, head to tracythomas.substack.com. And also, there are links to both in the show notes. Okay, see you in the Stacks. Okay, we're back. I want to talk about the Moria 6, and because that's a huge part of your book, in addition to the myth making and all of that, which is a group. Well, it's 6 individual Afghan young men. Some of them were minors. Some of them were adults. Some of them were both, according to the Greek and the Afghans, who were convicted of setting this fire that burns down this Moria refugee camp, which is this huge camp on Lesbos in Greece. And the camp was, you know, from my understanding, feels a lot like the southern border and maybe Arizona or Texas, which is just like one of the most politically toxic places when it comes to the border. And just like it's where all the conversations are being had about what's going on and what's wrong and what's right, et cetera. And so this fire happens. These 6 young people are convicted. They're blamed. They're criminalized. And I don't know. There's not really a question, but I want to talk about it because it feels bad. It feels really bad.
Yep. It was. Yes. No, there are so many threads there. And I think that, so effectively what the fascinating thing to me about Moria was that it was this camp, and it was widely known as Human Rights Graveyard. And not only is it widely known as that, there's a huge, to this day, and it's like a burned down, ruin. But to this day, on the concrete wall outside of it, it says "Welcome to Europe, Human Rights Graveyard," on it, and this massive graffiti. So it was widely known as this human rights graveyard, but no one on the left wanted it. None of the refugees wanted it because it was such an awful place. I mean, it was truly a place of like misery and squalor. It was completely neglected and completely abandoned. And it, many people, I talked to a guy who worked at the UN, and he was sort of like a career United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, like worker. He'd worked all over the world. He'd worked in some of the worst the most difficult, like worst supported refugee camps in the world. And he was like, this is honestly one of the hardest because this is Europe and this should be better. It shouldn't be like this. You know what I mean? So it was this place of neglect, and it was this potent symbol for how refugees were being met and treated in Europe, and the way that they were sort of relegated and kept on these hotspot islands in Greece, because the rest of Europe wouldn't take them, right? Until they went through a process that could take years. And so there was this group of people that were growing and growing and growing and had very few resources. But the right hated it too, right? The right hated it because they're like, get these people out of here. Like, we don't want these people on our island. Like, get these people out of here. And the left and, refugee solidarity people were like, get these people out of here because this is a human rights graveyard and this is awful and these camps shouldn't exist in the first place. I will say, and this is to like an earlier point, that a really interesting thing happened for me. You were sort of talking about the way, when you were talking about abolition, this notion of like the way we sort of sometimes make presumptions about the way things have to be because we are institutionalized in a way, like in our minds, right? Like we are stuck sometimes in our imaginations because the structures around us. It's sometimes when the structures are so heavy and oppressive, it's sometimes hard to see outside of them, right? I think that you're so right about that with abolition. And that was fascinating for me to see, because the thing about Moria was that it was an awful place. We're talking rats like biting kids' faces, it was infested with rats, like 500 people for a single toilet, everyone living in tents. It would snow some years and people were just living in tents with no heat. Then they'd put, little heaters or like cook stoves to warm, and then a fire would break out. It was just awful. Right. But they could leave, right? They could actually take the bus into town or walk to the beach, and they could leave, and then come back, right? Like it was an open air prison, but they could leave the open air prison. And I remember being in Greece at first being like, yeah, this is really bad, but like, at least they can leave, right? Because, in the United States, like they can't leave. And that spoke to me about just how, like, I've been writing about immigration, and, I wrote an op-ed called like The Cruelty of the US Immigration System, like calling for it to be dismantled. And yet I was still institutionalized in my mind into the like, well, at least they can leave. That's good, right? You know what I mean? Because like the normal for me is that refugees are locked up, even though I know how awful and abnormal and how that needs to end, right? So that's one of the things that called me to writing about Greece, and to writing about an immigration context and deeply researching an immigration context outside of the US, which is that like, I feel like after my last book, like I'm like, I have said what I have to say, and I'm saying it again and again and again, and I'm feeling stuck. I'm feeling like looping, like I'm feeling like I'm a little bit losing my mind because I'm just looping again and again. And it was really helpful to like go somewhere else and learn about what's happening there and be able to see these symmetries and be able to see the way my mind works and the places the grooves that I had gotten stuck in and the grooves that we've all gotten stuck in, right? So anyway, Moria was instructive to me. So Moria, in September of 2020, a massive fire broke out, and it quickly, over the course of 2 days, basically incinerated the entire place, like, to dust. There were about 11,000 people living there at the time. It was built, by the way, for 3,500. And those people were all set on the run. They were on the streets for weeks. When they tried to revolt and say, get us off the streets, there's not enough food, or, we're all like defecating in the streets. Like there's not enough sanitary, like we have no house. We're just in the streets after being displaced again, after being refugees, being displaced here. And there were the police tear gassed them. It was just a complete emergency and failure on the part of the Greek government to do the right thing. But what they needed was fall people, right? It was like, this place burned down. We think it's arson. These guys will do. And, I am the daughter of two criminal defense lawyers. I know that it is unlikely that we'll ever know for sure exactly what happened at the Moria fire. But I can tell you that there is absolutely no evidence that these 6 young people started the fire. Right. And in fact, an incredible kind of like digital research firm called Forensic Architecture did a remarkable report on the fire and showed, mapped the fire with the winds, with the drought. And it showed that it was probably honestly the effect of drought and climate change and just like a really, really, really hot summer with not a lot of water and massive overcrowding that caused this, this fire to just leap and spread incredibly quickly. So It probably wasn't even arson at all. In any case, the Greek government needed a fall guy, right? This horrible thing had happened. These 6 kids were fingered for the crime with very little evidence, and they've been in prison ever since September 2020.
You just mentioned something about yourself when you were talking about at least they can leave, and it kind of hadn't hit for you how maybe desensitized or how entrenched you were after having seen so many things. And you talk about how even these immigration court judges, they are suffering from vicarious trauma, and that there's just so much trauma from, obviously, first and foremost, the people who are leaving their homes, fleeing, crossing perilous waters or blistering deserts or whatever it is, mountains, whatever it is, to get to safety and to find a place where they can, survive. But also that has a huge trickle down effect, and that it's affecting the entire sort of immigration complex. And I'm wondering if you feel like, as a person who's witnessing this, if we're focusing enough on the trauma, or are we focusing too much on it? Or, I just am really curious, because as a person who's not there, who doesn't see it firsthand, I have my own opinions, but in reading your book, maybe they've changed. So I'm curious what you think about that.
That's such a fascinating question. I mean, I worked at a high school for many years where I coordinate for immigrant youth in Oakland, and I coordinated mental health services. And so my there's a part of me that's we never are focused enough on trauma and serving people who have been traumatized by these systems. But I will also say that the trauma is an effect, right? And the effect of experiences, and the effects of trauma follow an experience. And so much of the trauma related to immigration, once the border is crossed, have to do with the systems themselves, and even beforehand, right? And so I think, yes, of course, we must be focusing on the trauma. And I think that this question you're raising, I mean, as you know from reading the book, that this question of vicarious trauma and how numb many of us can become to really horrific conditions experienced by others, almost sometimes as a coping mechanism, right? The numbness serves us, right? Because it helps us not feel very difficult things, which then is very adversely impacts solidarity efforts, right? And fighting for justice and what's right. But for the people who have experienced trauma themselves, I mean, I would say absolutely we need to be focusing on the effects of that. What is the effect for these 6 young Afghans of having left their homes in Afghanistan, largely because of the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan, right? That has been going on for decades. They leave Afghanistan, they come to Greece, they're stuck for over a year in this horrific refugee camp. Then it burns down. Then they get fingered for the crime. And even though they can prove that they're children, they still get tried as adults. They were not in the place where the fire started. Doesn't matter. They have a 2-day trial. They get put in jail. And, as one of them told me relatively recently, actually, who's if I ever get out of prison, I have to get out of Greece immediately. This place has broken my heart. That's what he said to me. This place has broken my heart. And so the trauma that these young men have experienced is remarkable. But I think we want to focus not just on the trauma, but on the systems that caused it, right? Or that exacerbated it or perpetuated. And I think we sort of have to be holding both of those things simultaneously, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I guess like to this point of like holding both of these truths and like seeing refugees and immigrants as full realized human beings and not just people who have experienced trauma or people who are like whatever, you know, living through hell. That, and you call this out in the book, you say that like immigration stories, like both the writer and the reader are sort of cast as saviors. And like we focus on a lot of the people around the actual immigrants when we tell these stories, like the grandmothers who bring the cookies, or the crane operator guy, or the nice judge, or whatever that looks like. And I'm wondering, like, how can we tell better stories? Because so much of this book is about how we tell stories. How can we tell better stories that are holistic around people as individuals, and they don't become huddled masses or whatever it says on the Statue of Liberty? I don't know. It says
I think
things.
You got it. I think you got it.
She be saying things, Lady Liberty.
Totally.
But like how, because part of what is so crushing about what's going on is the sheer numbers of people, but also every people is a person, right? Like, so I don't know. And like, how do we remove our own savior complexes from these stories, both from as readers and writers?
Yeah. Such beautiful questions. You're such an amazing reader. I'm like, oh my gosh, she really read this book. Like, I did read it. I mean, I don't mean like, did you actually do your homework? I meant like, you're just such a brilliant reader, an insightful reader. It means so much. The ideal reader. That's absolutely, I actually realized relatively late in this book writing process. I'm like, oh, this is a book about storytelling and how we tell stories, and the thing you're saying about numbers, this is the paradox of writing. I think about any social issue and particularly migration, which is, what I write a lot about, which is that the numbers and the scale is incredibly important. And yet an overfocus on scale can obscure detail and individuality and nuance, right? And so it's like the journalist's job is to make meaning of scale, but how do you make meaning of scale without blurring the contours of what you're writing about? And, I talk about this all the time with my writing students. Part of the issue is like the sort of journalistic trope is, I'm going to write about the crisis of unhoused people in San Francisco. So I'm going to find one person that I'm going to follow, right? To make meaning of that, and to like, so that people can see what it's like to be an unhoused person in San Francisco. And again, I've written a story, many stories like this, but the problem with that is that, like, on the one hand, you are giving someone space on the page to be an individual, but on the other hand, you're making that person carry an entire socio-political dynamic on their shoulders, as if, and that's just like, that's a little bit of the trap. And so I feel like I'm not answering your question, but I'm mostly saying, yes, this is such an important question. One of the things when it comes to immigration stories that I'm particularly preoccupied with is we so often start immigration stories at the point of immigration, when actually, like, even the decision to migrate starts way before the person gets to the border, right? And the conditions that caused that person to migrate started way before they decided to migrate or even imagine migrating, and maybe even before they were born, right? So it's like, so it's kind of like there's like a scope that I'm interested in. Like, how do we hold a breadth and scope and sort of understanding of causality? Like, what were the conditions working upon this individual?
Right. Did you, he blurbed your book, but have you read Jonathan Blitzer's new one, Everyone Who's Gone Is Here?
So fantastic. Yeah.
I'm reading it, but I was reading it while I was reading your book, and I was fuck, I got to stop. I don't know. I don't know how it happened. I think I was like reading his on audio, and then anyways.
Yeah.
But he does a great job in that book of going back really far to tell his subject stories, to the point where I'm like 30% into the book, and I was like, wait, is this guy going to the United States? Like, what? Like, I'm like legitimately like, wait, I've been with this guy for 30 years already, and like, we're not even in Like,
Totally.
he's just like hanging out in Mexico for decades. So I think he does a really great job of that. And I that was something that stuck out to me, like kind of reading your books together. But then I had to pause because I was like, I'm starting to like blur, you know?
Yeah, of course. No,
Um,
I mean, that's like such a valiant project of his book, is sort of showing all of the causalities that kind of played out, and all of the ways various elements of geopolitical decisions played out upon places in Central America, the countries in Central America that are now, have these like mass exoduses, because we
Right.
can't look at any one historical moment, even if that moment is now, in any kind of vacuum, right?
Right.
I would
Right.
also say, to your question of sort of like, how do we tell better stories, is, and this can sort of be tropey, but it's like, how do we allow the people to be more than just the experience? How do we as storytellers make space for people to be people and exist beyond the bounds of the sociopolitical dynamic we are writing about? Do you know what I mean? And that's been really, really important to me. I mean, I will say, like, with my first book, which is The Faraway Brothers, I write about these identical twin brothers. I know you have twins.
Yes, I have identical twin brothers.
And what was so fascinating about them to me was so many things, but it was, they had really different experiences of their own immigration stories, and you kind of couldn't find two people who were more the same. They were raised by the same people, they look exactly alike, like they'd spent almost all of their waking and sleeping hours in very close proximity to each other, and yet they experienced the same events differently, like internally.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I don't have a great answer except for like a real attempt to hold that question at the red hot center of everything we're writing.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, that kind of question that I ask is usually not just for you and for me, but also for people listening, like to think about it a little bit, because there isn't really a good answer. And I'm sure if I asked every person who's ever written a thing about a person who's ever immigrated, they'd have a different answer. Or if I asked every person who's ever immigrated, like that
totally.
But that is something that deserves our attention, like as we try to like read and engage with what's going on.
Yeah.
And speaking of reading, one of my, as you said before so kindly, I'm the ideal reader, which I appreciate. I'm not, but I love it. But one of the things I love reading is the acknowledgments of a book, and yours are fantastic.
Aww.
And I have two questions about your acknowledgments. One is, you mention Maggie Nelson's idea of a ghost book.
Yes.
Can you explain what that is? I've never heard that before, and I'd love to know a little bit more.
Yes, the ghost text. Actually, one of my, a student who's like an incredible novelist who was in one of my classes that I taught, brought this notion to my attention. I was like, oh, yes. So Maggie Nelson said that a lot of her books have a kind of ghost book, and, a book that secretly or not so secretly, as the case may be, stands behind my book, not just as its muse, but often as its literal stylistic and or structural model. So it's this idea that like there's a book that your book is in either direct conversation with on the page, or maybe even just like you're in constant conversation in your mind with it as you're writing. And so mine, I was so taken with that because I was like, wait, I have one of those. I know exactly what she's talking about. You know what I mean? It like hit me with I recognized what she was talking about, because mine is a book by Svetlana Boym called The Future of Nostalgia, which is just a remarkable book where she's looking at this notion of nostalgia and has kind of an interesting framework for thinking about nostalgia. And she has sort of two different kind of categories of nostalgia. One is more like sort of emotional and self-conscious and sort of thinks longingly toward the past, but with an understanding that there's a distance between past and present. And there's some, there's a longing for a past and maybe a recognition that it might not exist in the way that we long for it. And then there's something called restorative nostalgia, which is the kind of nostalgia we see in like white supremacist movements and nationalistic movements of this kind of like, make America great again. Like there is this past moment, this past time, this past era that we must return to. And that, of course, that past never is real. That past never exists. But it's a mythological past. And she writes about the way nostalgia plays out over the way cities are designed. And she's just like a brilliant theorist. And I just read that book again and again and again. And it helped sharpen my thinking. It helped expand my thinking. It was also suggested to me actually on stage by the writer Sasha Himon, Alexander Himon. And he was talking about this book, and I was like, I must go read it. And I read an excerpt that very night, and then immediately, got my hands on the book. So I owe a lot to Sasha Himon for bringing my ghost text to my attention.
I just love that so much. I love the idea of a ghost book or ghost text, because one of the questions I always ask people is, what's a book that, like, what's something that you would recommend, or like that your work is in conversation with? And a lot of times when I ask that question, people answer, but sometimes people are like, they have no idea. And that is very hard for me to fathom, because there's so many times when I'm reading a book and I'm like, this is in conversation with this thing. Totally. And sometimes I'm like, okay, maybe they've never read it. But sometimes I'm like, I know you've read this. Like, I know this is in your brain somewhere. And like, maybe you're not thinking of it in that way, but like, I am seeing the parallels.
Totally.
The other thing you say in your acknowledgments is that this book, A Map of Future Ruins, owes everything to your life as a reader. And I want you to say more about that.
Yeah. I mean, it's connected to exactly what you just said. I took a picture of this like a mass stack of books that influenced this book and that helped me both learn specific things, fill holes. I talk about this with students, this notion of like, as a writer, there are holes you have when you're approaching a project. And I think this is true of fiction, what little I write of fiction, I'm hoping to write more. And it's certainly true in nonfiction. Like, I didn't know that much about the Greek debt crisis, for instance. You know what I mean? Like, but then there are hungers. Like, I just wanted to learn more about the Oracle. Like, maybe there was something there. I just wanted to learn more about that. So I read an excellent book called The Oracle by William Broad, a New York Times reporter, which was like super fantastic. And so like there was this stack of books that were attending to both my holes and my hungers. And there was sort of like, these are things I need to learn in order to like be able to write this book, to understand the things that people are telling me, but also to like further attend to my hungers and just these things that I'm kind of interested in learning, and these rabbit holes I want to follow to see, what's there. But it's also true that this book is a little bit more discursive than my first book. It's much more of a weaving together of ideas and storylines, and it was a little bit terrifying to do that because it's just harder structurally to do. And it took a little bit of courage to deviate from like what I had done before, and to kind of take that leap into like, maybe these things go together. I feel like they do in my heart. Can I convince other people that this holds together? And I think the only way I could amass that courage is by reading, and just reading books. So, yeah.
Well, I don't have to ask you the question of what books you would recommend that are in conversation with your work, because you've already given us some. So we'll just pretend like I asked, but it's on the record. But I do have to ask you about how you write. Where are you? How many hours a day? How often? Snacks and beverages. You do mention in the book that you drink tea,
I do.
Which I clocked because I am a tea girly. So I need to know about how you drink your tea, what kind of tea you drink, if you drink it while you write. I know you mentioned being in the backyard writing. So just set the scene for us.
Yes, absolutely. I love this question. So I recently just moved, so my setup is different and a little bit more chaotic. But my partner and I lived in a 600 square foot house until very recently, and we also have a kid and a cat. And we had a tiny little backyard in Berkeley. So we blessedly, right before the pandemic, we built a little hut in the backyard, and that's where I wrote. And it was this beautiful. I actually had a dream once that I was like, I had this like really kind of incredible like one of those dreams that you were like, something else was going on. There was sort of like, I was accessing some like higher, I don't know, higher insight. And I had this dream that I like had this office within a redwood, and that's where I was like creating I was a painter for some reason in this dream. But in fact, this little office that we built was this magical little cabin, super tiny, maybe like 60 square feet, that was made of this like salvaged redwood that we found. So it was this beautiful space that our friend Dylan built for me. And I wrote this book almost entirely there during the pandemic. I have to write with tea. I'm a black tea drinker.
Straight up, or milk and sugar?
It's rarely sugar, sometimes milk. Like my Earl Grey tea, I kind of like have to do, I wake up in the morning, I'm like, which tea is it today?
Yes,
so Earl Grey tea, are you? Okay, yes. I want to hear what other teas. Earl Grey tea always wants milk, but I've actually been drinking this tea that I got in Greece that has this it's black tea, but it has this, it's called mastica or mastic gum. It's like a sort of like a bay leafy minty kind of deal that's infused into the tea. It's really good. And that wants no milk. And I will say I wish that I was like a more ritualized writer, in the sense that like I wish that I was like, I wake up and then I do this and these are my best times of day. But I have to say my writing is like a bit catch as catch can. You know, I have a couple of other jobs. I have a kid. I have, you know, and so I'm trying to sort of like carve out particular times. I am trying to write a novel, and I'm trying to be like every Friday morning, that's what I do for an hour, just to like see what comes out of that. But I have to say, when I find time is when I write, and I try to carve that time out, but it's not necessarily ritualized.
Right. Yeah. Do you do snacks?
Totally. Dark chocolate. I have dark. Yeah. That's my main snack and my main like
I'll
treat.
allow that. I find dark chocolate to be kind of disgusting.
Really? Even though you're a black tea drinker?
Yes, but I put milk and sugar in my tea, and my tea comes out very cloudy.
I love it.
It's kind of like a tinted milk, I think is what it is.
Are you like an Earl
black
Grey?
tea, Earl Grey, English breakfast.
Yep.
But I will sometimes drink like a chai from a tea bag, not like a concentrate latte.
Yep.
But I've gotten like embarrassingly snobby about my tea. I used to just be like, I used to drink like whatever they had at Starbucks and be like, this is great. Now I went to Starbucks a few weeks ago and got tea and was like, I can't drink this garbage. And I was like, I have gone too far. Like when I have friends who travel, if they're going to like Europe or Canada, like, I'll have them bring me back tea. Yes. My mom was in London. She bought me back this like black rose from Fortnum and Mason that is like the best tea ever. And I ration it out. Another friend was in London and bought me this black tea from Sketch, the high tea place. It's so good.
What was the rose tea? Because Rebecca Solnit got me this, like, it truly came in a treasure box. It was like called Akbar, I think, this rose tea. And I just finished it and I need to like find it again.
Okay. I will send you my 2 rose teas because I have a Parisian rose tea and then a British rose tea.
Oh my gosh. I need to know. And next time I'm curious if you like this mastic tea. So I'll get you some next time I go back.
Literally anybody who drinks tea on the show, I end up having a full, like I ended up sending Jasmine Ward like box of teas, like a sampler of my favorite teas.
Tea girly too.
She likes a black tea also.
Amazing.
Yeah. So there's few of us because it's a lot of like green tea or like herbal tea, and I'm not interested in those people.
No,
but the black tea drinkers,
we're
a
crew. We're
a family.
Stick together.
Yes. It's you, me, and Jasmine right now. And also I think Crystal Hannah Kim drinks black tea.
Oh, that's really good to know.
I used to be like her and reuse the tea and the tea bag over and over. But now I need a stronger concentrate for all my milk.
Same. I kind of like the second brew. It's just it doesn't do it for me. No.
Me neither. I've started just being really just splurging and just a fresh tea bag. I just need a fresh tea bag.
Totally. Yeah. Love the tea fam.
Yes, me too. I'm so glad to have this. When I saw it in the book, I was like, page 249, like make a note. Okay, another thing that I'm passionate about is being a terrible speller. So what is a word that you can never spell correctly on the first try?
Oh my God, no words.
Are you a terrible speller as well?
Oh my God, I'm a terrible speller. Especially, I have a problem with I put double T's or double M's or like they don't exist. So like commitment.
Yes, commitment, committee. How about the E's on committee? I don't know. Maybe there's 5
That is easier for me because it's so weird that I'm just like, I know they got 2 at the end, but I don't know the other ones. Like the double T's and the double M's and like I can't. Yeah, I mean, I'm truly a terrible speller.
Good, me too.
Towel. Does it have 2 L's? I don't know. I don't think so, but I think it might. Yeah. Like I could see it either way. It's like I don't see it. I don't see the words.
I'm with you. I can't see it. Yep. And once I learn it, I can't retain it. Recommendation.
Completely.
Like a month or 2 ago, I spelled recommendation correctly on the first try, and I was like, "What did I do?
Job.
What did I do?" Haven't done it since.
But then it's like everything's got spell check, so it's like I don't have to learn at this point. I'm 40. You know what I mean?
Well, I've recently started taking notes in my own books which I used to just take notes on my phone. And now I'm like, what if my children and like I died in like 50 years? They're like, Mom couldn't
lady,
spell.
but she doesn't spell. Yeah.
They're going to be like, what does that say?
I think that'll just be endearing.
I hope so.
It says nothing.
I hope so. Yeah. It's a no. It's an acronym. Don't worry. So we're like so out of time. So I just have one more question for you, which is if you could have one person, dead or alive, read this book, who would you want it to be?
Oh my God. I have to say, is this a cop-out? Like, I would be so interested in what Svetlana Boym had to say about this book. Or like not even had to say. I think I would just be like so honored to know it like reached her hands. And unfortunately, she passed a few years back. And Masha Gessen wrote like a beautiful just sort of, I don't know, ode to her. But I think I'd say like Svetlana Boym just because I would want to like say thank you. This book is thanks in large part.
I love that. It's not a cop-out. Yeah. Every answer is allowed on this one.
Okay, great.
People, you can get a map of future ruins now wherever you get your books. I will let you know that I read 80% of this book off the page, but I did listen to about 5 chapters via audio just to get a sense. It's not Lauren who reads them, but your audiobook narrator does a really good job. And I was like, I could believe this is Lauren. Like I felt like she really nailed it. So for my audiobook people, stamp of approval. For my eye readers, stamp of approval. Get the book wherever you get your books. Lauren, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Tracy. This was such a joy. You were just such a brilliant reader and community advocate and person. And thank goodness for you.
You can come back anytime you want to give me compliments.
Great. Love compliments. And tea.
And tea.
Compliments
and everyone else, we will see you in the stacks. All right, y'all, that does it for us today. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to Lauren Markham for being my guest. I'd also like to say thank you to Shaylin Tavella for helping to make this conversation possible. Remember, the Stacks Book Club pick for February is Viral Justice, How We Grow the World We Want by Ruha Benjamin. We will be discussing that book on Wednesday, February 28th with Dr. Uche Blackstock. If you love The Stacks and you want inside access to it, head over to patreon.com/The Stacks and join The Stacks Pack. Make sure you're subscribed to The Stacks wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you're listening through Apple Podcasts, be sure to leave us a rating and a review. For more from The Stacks, follow us on social media at The Stacks Pod on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok, at The Stacks Pod _ on Twitter, and check out our website, thestackspodcast.com. Today's episode of The Stacks was edited by Christian Duenas with production assistance from Lauren Tyree. Our graphic designer is Robin McCrite, and our theme music is from Tagirigis. The Stacks is created and produced by me, Tracy Thomas.